My MIL faked cancer when I got pregnant, demanding we name the baby after her before she died. The day after we announced my pregnancy, my mother-in-law Diane called sobbing. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer, 6 months, maybe 8 if I'm lucky. Paul was destroyed. His dad died 5 years ago. Now his mom was dying too. We dropped everything. I drove her to chemo appointments. Paul took time off work. We spent our entire baby savings on her comfort. First thing she asked, name the baby after me. Diana or Daniel. I need my name to live on. We'd already picked names, but how could we refuse Paul's dying mother? Diane became obsessed with her legacy, demanded her maiden name as middle name, wanted the nursery decorated exactly like hers as a baby, gave us a list of traits to instill in Diana or Daniel. She cried about never meeting her grandchild, planned her funeral around my due date, recorded hundreds of videos for birthdays she'd miss, bought presents for every milestone. Heartbreaking, if it was real. She refused to let us attend oncology appointments. Don't want you seeing me vulnerable. She'd disappear for treatment, then return looking perfect. Never lost her hair. New targeted therapy. Never lost weight, actually gained. Steroids cause bloating. Only sick when convenient. Sudden pain during conversations not about her. Too weak for our plans, but energy to redecorate my entire nursery. I saw her eating sushi she claimed was forbidden. She went on a weekend trip when supposedly too weak for the mailbox. Mixed up medication names. But if Paul questioned anything, she'd sob about us not believing she was dying. 5 months pregnant, Diane escalated. Cancer spread to liver and brain. 2 months left. We needed to move in immediately. Paul was ready to quit his job. Then she made a mistake. Gave us a medical bill showing treatment costs. Why we needed to save rent money by moving in. But I looked closely. Routine colonoscopy from 3 years ago. Date changed with pen. I started investigating. Called her cancer center. No patient record. Checked insurance. No cancer claims. No chemo prescriptions. Nothing. Hired a private investigator without telling Paul. Diane spent treatment hours at the casino. Gambling money we gave for medical bills. Joined online cancer support groups under fake names, stealing their stories. The investigator photographed her at the gym, restaurants, dancing at bars, during chemo, or when too sick to move. Her last birthday party. She'd invited everyone to say goodbye. Made a speech about Diana or Daniel carrying on her legacy. Asked Paul to promise publicly the baby would have her name. I stood up. Said we had important news about Diane's health. Pulled out everything. Fake bills, casino receipts, photos of her living normally, confirmation she was never a cancer patient. Room exploded. Paul read papers repeatedly, confusion turning to rage. Asked her for one real proof of cancer. She tried lying. Hospital lost records. Investigator wrong. Photos old. Then Paul's aunt spoke. She did this when your dad was dying. Claimed lupus for attention during his cancer. Other relatives shared similar stories. Diane's mysterious illnesses during others' important moments. Paul looked at her. You're dead to me. Said she'd never meet her grandchild. Never know their name. Anyone who'd fake cancer to manipulate their pregnant daughter-in-law was evil. Guests left one by one. We left that night. Changed numbers. Moved without telling her. Our daughter Emily Rose is 3 now. Nothing to do with Diane's name. Diane tried everything. Sent letters claiming she's really sick now. Showed up at Paul's work. Security removes her. Threatened grandparent rights. Lawyers laugh when hearing what she did. She lost friends when they learned about fake cancer. Banned from support groups for lying. Alone in that big house, surrounded by presents for a grandchild she'll never know. Gambled away retirement, working at 70. Everyone knows she faked cancer to steal her grandchild's name. She cried wolf about dying. Now she's dead to everyone who matters. Part 1. But yesterday, Paul's aunt called. Diane's in the hospital. We don't care. No, listen, she's really sick. Like actually dying. She's lied before. I saw the scans myself. Brain tumor. Inoperable. The doctors say 2 weeks, maybe less. Paul went silent. She doesn't know I'm calling. But she keeps asking for Emily. Says she has something important to tell you. About your father. My dad? She's been saying his death wasn't what you thought. That she needs to confess before she dies. This is just another manipulation. The hospital confirmed everything. I can send you the medical records. She's on morphine, barely conscious most of the time. But she keeps saying Paul's name and I'm sorry about what I did to his father. Paul's hands shook. His dad supposedly died of a heart attack. Alone with Diane. What did she do to my father? She won't tell anyone but you. says Emily deserves to know the truth about her grandfather. We looked at each other. Could this be real, or the ultimate manipulation? I stare at Paul across our kitchen table while his aunt's words echo through the speakerphone between us. Brain tumor, inoperable, 2 weeks, confession about his father. Paul's face has gone completely white and his hands are shaking as he grips his coffee mug hard enough that I worry it might shatter. The aunt keeps talking, but I barely hear her because I'm watching Paul's knuckles turn bone white around the ceramic. His jaw clenches and unclenches like he's trying to physically hold himself together. I reach across and put my hand over his, feeling the tremors running through his whole body. The aunt is still going on about scans and doctors and morphine when I cut her off mid-sentence. I tell her we need time to think and end the call despite her protests that Diane might not have much time left. Paul just sits there frozen after I hang up. I can see him mentally back in that hospital room 5 years ago when they told him his dad was gone. Sudden heart attack. Nothing anyone could have done. His eyes have that same hollow look they had then, like someone pulled the floor out from under him. He stares at the phone sitting silent on the table between us like it might ring again and tell him this was all a mistake. We spend the next hour in silence while Emily plays in the living room, oblivious to the bomb that just dropped on our carefully constructed piece. I hear her singing to her dolls, something about going to the park and getting ice cream. Normal 3-year-old stuff. Meanwhile, Paul hasn't moved from his chair and I'm sitting here trying to figure out what the hell we're supposed to do with this information. Paul finally speaks and his voice sounds hollow when he asks if I think his mother could really be dying this time, or if it's just another manipulation with higher stakes. I don't have an answer, because honestly, I don't know. Diane spent months convincing everyone she was dying before. She had fake medical bills. She told elaborate stories about treatment. She cried about never meeting her grandchild. All lies. But the aunt said she saw scans herself. Said the hospital confirmed everything. That's more than we ever got last time. I pull up my laptop and start researching brain tumors, survival rates, symptoms, anything that might help us figure out if this is real. My fingers fly across the keyboard while Paul watches me like I might find some magical answer in WebMD. The aunt mentioned she saw scans herself and the hospital confirmed everything, which is more verification than we ever got during the fake cancer saga. I read about glioblastomas and astrocytomas and inoperable masses. 2-week survival time matches what I'm seeing for late-stage brain tumors. But Diane is smart enough to research this stuff too. She did it before with the pancreatic cancer. She knew all the right terms, all the right symptoms. I close the laptop and look at Paul. He's staring at his phone now, waiting for something. Paul's phone buzzes with a text from his aunt containing photos of medical documents. CT scan reports, oncology consultation notes, hospice intake forms. Paul opens each image with shaking hands, and I lean over to look. The hospital names and doctor signatures look legitimate, and there's a level of medical detail that would be nearly impossible to fake. I see dates from the past 6 months showing progression. I see actual scan images with bright white masses visible even to my untrained eye. I see notes about declining neurological function and recommendations for palliative care only. Paul zooms in on the doctor's signature, then pulls up the hospital website on his phone to verify the neurologist is real. Dr. Luke Takahashi, specializing in neuro-oncology. The photo matches the signature style. Everything looks real, but we've been burned before. I suggest we call the hospital directly to verify Diane is actually a patient there, which we can do without talking to her. Paul nods and dials the main number with shaking hands. He puts it on speaker so I can hear. The operator answers, and Paul asks to confirm a patient admission for Diane Peterson. His voice cracks on his mother's name. There's typing sounds, and then the operator confirms Diane is currently in their palliative care unit, room 412. Does he want to be connected? Paul says no and hangs up. We look at each other across the table and the reality starts sinking in. She's really there. She's really sick. This might actually be real this time. We look at each other across the table and I can see Paul's anger warring with something that looks like grief or maybe guilt. His face keeps shifting between hard and broken. He says he doesn't know if he can walk into that hospital room after 3 years of silence. Doesn't know if he can trust anything she says even on her deathbed. 3 years of peace we've built. 3 years of protecting Emily from Diane's toxicity. 3 years of finally feeling safe. And now this. I watch him struggle with it, see the war happening behind his eyes. Part of him wants to tell his aunt to go to hell and never think about Diane again. But there's another part, the part that lost his dad 5 years ago, that can't quite let go. I remind him about the cryptic message regarding his father, and ask if he can live with never knowing what she meant. Paul's jaw tightens, and he admits that's the part that's killing him, because his dad's death never quite made sense. Healthy 58-year-old dropping dead with no warning signs. Paul's been carrying that confusion for 5 years, telling himself it was just bad luck, just one of those things. But what if it wasn't? What if Diane knows something about how his father really died? What if she did something? The questions hang between us heavy and dark. Paul runs his hands through his hair and I can see him spiraling. His father died alone with Diane, just the two of them in the house. Heart attack, the death certificate said. But what if there's more to it? Emily wanders into the kitchen asking why Daddy looks sad and if we can go to the park. Her little voice cuts through the tension like sunshine through storm clouds. Paul scoops her up and holds her tight, and I watch him breathe in the strawberry scent of her shampoo, like he's anchoring himself to what matters most. Emily wraps her arms around his neck and pats his cheek with her small hand. She asks again about the park, and Paul promises they'll go tomorrow. He carries her back to the living room and sets her down with her toys. I hear him tell her Daddy just has some grown-up stuff to think about, but everything is okay. Emily accepts this easily the way 3-year-olds do and goes back to her dolls. Paul comes back to the kitchen and sits down hard in his chair. That night, after Emily is asleep, Paul pulls out the box of his father's belongings he's kept in the closet. Photos, documents, the death certificate. He carries it to our bed and spreads everything across the comforter like evidence at a crime scene. I sit beside him as he picks up each item with careful hands. Photos of his dad at his college graduation, at our wedding, holding baby Emily in the hospital just months before he died. Paul stares at the death certificate like he's seeing it for the first time, noting it lists acute myocardial infarction as cause of death. His finger traces the words, signed by the medical examiner, dated 5 years ago. Paul looks up at me and asks, what if Diane is telling the truth about having something to confess? What if his father's death wasn't what we thought? I sit beside him and point out that the certificate shows his father was alone with Diane when he died. We already knew that, but now the detail feels heavier, loaded with new meaning. Paul stares at the paper and tells me his dad had complained about feeling off for weeks before he died. Diane kept insisting he was fine and didn't need to see a doctor. Paul remembers his father mentioning chest tightness and his mother waving it away as stress. I watch Paul's hands shake as he sets the certificate down and asks what if Diane prevented his father from getting help? What if she let him die? We sit in silence for a long time while that possibility settles over us like a weight. Finally, I tell him we need to investigate before making any decisions about seeing Diane. If she's really dying, we need to know what we're walking into. I grab a notebook and start making a list of people we can contact. His father's friends, former colleagues, neighbors from that time, anyone who might remember details about those final weeks. Paul adds names as they come to him. Evan from the office who gave the eulogy. The Birches who lived next door. His dad's doctor if we can track him down. We need facts before we face whatever truth Diane is holding. I sleep badly that night, mind spinning through scenarios of what Diane might confess. Paul tosses beside me, and I know he's doing the same thing. The next morning, I call Paul's aunt back while he's in the shower. I ask specific questions about what Diane has been saying regarding Paul's father. The aunt's voice drops lower, and she admits Diane keeps repeating that she didn't mean for it to happen, that she made terrible mistakes. But she won't elaborate until she sees Paul face to face. I press for more details, but the aunt says that's all Diane will say before she drifts back into morphine sleep. I thank her and hang up feeling cold all over. Paul comes out of the bathroom and I tell him what the aunt said. His jaw tightens and he says he's taking the day off work. We drop Emily at daycare before driving to the county records office. The building smells like old paper and floor cleaner. We approach the clerk and request copies of all documentation related to his father's death. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a chain, tells us it will take a few days to pull everything from archives. We can request medical examiner reports, ambulance records, and hospital intake notes. Paul fills out the forms with careful handwriting while I watch people come and go with their own tragic paperwork. We pay the processing fee, and the clerk gives us a receipt with a pickup date 4 days from now. 4 days feels like forever when you're waiting for answers about whether your mother killed your father. While we wait for official records, I track down Evan. I find his contact information through Paul's old work directory and call him during lunch. He sounds surprised to hear from me, but agrees to meet us for coffee that afternoon. We drive to a shop near his office and find him already there, looking older than I remember from the funeral. He stands when we approach and shakes Paul's hand with genuine warmth. We order drinks and sit in a corner booth where we can talk quietly. Paul explains that Diane is dying for real this time, and has been saying things about his father's death that don't add up. Evan's expression shifts to something careful and sad. He tells us he always thought something was off about how Paul's father died. The guy had just passed his annual physical with flying colors 2 months before. Evan leans forward and mentions that Paul's dad had complained about Diane being weird about his medications. She insisted on managing all his prescriptions herself, even though he was perfectly capable. Paul goes very still across from me and asks what medications his father was taking. Evan remembers blood pressure medication and something for cholesterol, both routine for a man his age. But then Evan says Paul's dad mentioned once that Diane had started giving him additional supplements. She claimed they would help his heart. He felt worse after starting them, not better. Paul's coffee sits untouched as Evan continues. He says Paul's father had joked about Diane turning into a nurse, always fussing over his pills and vitamins. But there was something in how he said it that made Evan uncomfortable at the time. Like Paul's dad was bothered but trying to laugh it off. I ask if Paul's father ever mentioned wanting to see a doctor about feeling worse, and Evan nods. He says yes, multiple times in those final weeks. But Diane kept telling him it was nothing, that he just needed to adjust to the new supplements, that doctors would overreact and put him on unnecessary medications. Evan looks at Paul with real sorrow in his eyes and says he wishes he'd pushed harder, encouraged Paul's dad to go to the emergency room anyway. Paul tells him it's not his fault, and Evan shakes his head like he's carried this guilt for 5 years. We finish our coffee and thank him for talking to us. He makes Paul promise to let him know if there's anything he can do to help. We walk back to our car in silence, both processing what Evan told us. The supplements Diane gave Paul's father. Her insistence on managing his medications. Her dismissal of his symptoms. It's starting to paint a picture neither of us wants to see clearly. We drive to the hospital that afternoon and I can feel Paul's dread coming off him in waves. He grips the steering wheel tight and his breathing is shallow. I reach over and squeeze his hand, but don't say anything because there's nothing to say that will make this easier. We walk through the automatic doors and follow signs to the hospice floor. The elevator ride up feels endless. The hospice floor is quiet and dim with soft lighting meant to be soothing. A nurse at the desk directs us to Diane's room and I can see Paul forcing himself to keep walking. When we reach her door, I squeeze his hand one more time before he pushes it open. The smell hits me first. That particular hospital smell mixed with something sour and wrong. Diane looks genuinely terrible in a way that shocks us both. Her face is gaunt with skin pulled tight over bones. Patchy hair loss shows pink scalp underneath. Her skin has a yellow tint that speaks of organ failure. Oxygen tubes run to her nose and monitors beep quietly beside the bed. This is the whole devastating reality of actual dying. Nothing like the healthy woman we exposed 3 years ago. She opens her eyes when we enter and tears immediately start streaming down her face. She whispers Paul's name like a prayer, like she can't believe he's really there. Paul stands frozen in the doorway, and I watch him struggle between 3 years of justified rage and the visceral reality of his mother's body shutting down. Diane reaches a shaking hand toward him and begs him to come closer. Her voice is hoarse and weak when she says she doesn't have much time and needs to tell him the truth about his father. Paul doesn't move and his whole body is rigid with tension. I stay near the door, giving him space to decide what he needs to do. Diane's hand drops back to the bed and she starts crying harder. These awful gasping sobs that make the monitors beep faster. She says please, please, she needs him to know what really happened. That she's sorry, so sorry, she never meant for any of it. Paul finally takes one step forward, then another, until he's standing beside her bed but not touching her. His voice comes out flat and hard when he tells her to stop talking about the fake cancer and tell him what she did to his father. Diane's face breaks apart and she reaches toward Paul with shaking fingers. Her words tumble out fast and desperate about being sorry and never meaning to hurt anyone, and how everything got out of control. Paul takes another step closer to the bed and his whole body looks like he's forcing himself forward against invisible resistance. Diane's hand shoots out and grabs his wrist with strength that surprises both of us. She starts talking faster, saying she knows she messed up everything, and the lies just kept getting bigger, and she couldn't stop. Paul yanks his hand back and his voice cuts through her rambling like a knife. He tells her to shut up about the fake cancer, and tell him what she did to his father. The room goes quiet except for the beeping monitors. Diane's face crumples inward and fresh tears pour down her yellow cheeks. She says she didn't kill him, but she didn't save him either, and that's almost worse. Paul stands completely still waiting, and I can see his chest barely moving like he's forgotten how to breathe. Diane starts crying harder, and the words come out between sobs. She says Paul's father started having chest pains 3 weeks before he died. He told her his chest felt tight and his arm hurt, and he wanted to go to the emergency room. But Diane convinced him it was just indigestion from the spicy food they'd eaten. She gave him antacids and told him to lie down and rest. When he said the pain kept coming back over the next few days, she insisted he was overreacting and didn't need doctors poking around. She admits now that she was scared they'd find something wrong with him, and all the attention would shift to him instead of her. She couldn't stand the thought of him being sick when she needed to be the one people worried about. Paul's face goes from white to bright red, and I watch his hands curl into fists at his sides. Diane keeps talking like she can't stop now that she's started. She admits she'd been secretly replacing his blood pressure medication with sugar pills for months. She liked the drama when his blood pressure would spike, and he'd have episodes that required her care. She'd researched enough online to know it was dangerous, but told herself she could control it. She thought she'd know if things got too serious, and she could always give him the real medication back. The day Paul's father died, Diane says he collapsed in their kitchen, clutching his chest. She stood there watching him on the floor for almost 10 minutes, trying to decide if she should call for help. She was terrified the hospital would discover the medication switch when they tested his blood. She was scared they'd blame her and she'd get in trouble. So she wasted precious minutes staging the scene to look like sudden, unexpected cardiac arrest. She moved his pill bottles around and made sure the sugar pills were hidden. She practiced what she'd say to the paramedics. By the time she finally called for help, Paul's father had been without oxygen for too long. The paramedics tried everything, but his brain had been damaged and his heart wouldn't restart properly. They saw a man in his 50s with known heart issues and a wife performing frantic attempts to save him. They had no reason to investigate further. The death got ruled natural causes and nobody questioned it. Paul backs away from the bed like Diane's words are physically shoving him across the room. I watch him try to process what he's hearing, and his face goes through about 10 different expressions in 5 seconds. He asks in a voice that sounds strangled if she's saying she let his father die to cover up her medication tampering. Diane sobs harder and says she never meant for him to actually die. She just panicked when it was happening. She starts talking about how she's been sick her whole life, even if not the way people thought. She says she's always needed to be the center of attention, and she can't help creating medical situations. She knows something is wrong with her brain, but not the tumor. Something deeper that makes her do these things. A nurse walks into the room carrying a chart and stops short when she sees Paul's red face and Diane's sobbing. The nurse gives us a sympathetic look like she thinks we're a grieving family having a painful goodbye. She checks Diane's vitals and adjusts her IV while we all stand there in terrible silence. The whole situation hits me hard because Diane is genuinely dying this time, but she's using her real death the exact same way she used fake illnesses. Everything is still about manipulation and attention even now. The nurse finishes her checks and leaves quietly, and the door clicks shut behind her. Paul tells Diane he needs to leave and process what she's told him. Diane becomes frantic immediately and reaches for him again. She begs him not to go and says she has more to confess. Paul keeps walking toward the door and I move aside to let him pass. Diane cries out that she took out life insurance on Emily without our permission. She says she's been planning for years how to get access to her grandchild. I can't move. My feet are stuck to the hospital floor like someone poured glue on my shoes. Diane's voice keeps going and she's saying Paul's name over and over. She says she needed documents to prove she had rights to Emily. She took Paul's social security number from old tax papers in their house. She forged his signature on forms claiming he agreed to grandparent visitation. She filed paperwork with 3 different lawyers trying to establish some legal connection to our daughter. Every single lawyer told her the same thing. No relationship means no rights. Faking cancer means definitely no rights. But she kept trying anyway. She made copies of Emily's birth certificate somehow. She created fake emails pretending to be Paul saying he wanted his mother involved. She even tried to get Emily enrolled in activities using forged permission slips with our signatures. Paul spins around so fast I think he might fall over. His face isn't red anymore. It's gone past red into something that looks almost gray. His voice comes out quiet and cold in a way I've never heard before. He tells Diane she just proved exactly why we were right to cut her out of our lives completely. Every word sounds like he's carving it into stone. Diane starts wailing louder and reaches both hands toward him. She says she's dying and that should mean something. She says dying people deserve forgiveness. She says she needs to hear him say he forgives her before she goes. Paul stands perfectly still and tells her that dying doesn't erase what she did. Dying doesn't make her entitled to forgiveness she hasn't earned. Dying doesn't mean he owes her comfort or peace or anything at all. I grab Paul's arm and pull him toward the door. Diane's crying gets louder behind us. She's calling Paul's name and saying please over and over. A different nurse rushes past us into the room. I hear her asking Diane to calm down and offering medication. We walk fast down the hallway past the other rooms, past the nurse's station where someone looks up with concern, past the waiting area where an old man sits reading a magazine. We don't stop until we're through the main doors and into the parking lot. The afternoon sun hits my eyes and makes me blink. Paul walks straight to our car and gets in the driver's seat. I climb in the passenger side and barely get my door closed before he puts his head down on the steering wheel. His whole body starts shaking. These awful sounds come out of him that I've never heard before. He's sobbing so hard he can't breathe right. He keeps saying his father's name between sobs. He says his mother killed him. He says she killed him through being a coward. He says she watched him die to save herself from getting in trouble. I reach over and put my hand on his back. I can feel every muscle tight under his shirt. I don't say anything because there's nothing to say that would make this better. I just sit there while he cries and cries. My own anger builds up inside my chest like something physical. I want to march back into that hospital room and scream at Diane. I want to tell her she's poison. I want to tell her she poisoned her husband and her son, and tried to poison our family too. Even now, when she's genuinely dying, she's using it for manipulation. Even now, she's making everything about her needs and her wants and her desperate grab for attention. She confessed to letting Paul's father die, but she made it part of her deathbed drama. She told us about forging documents, but framed it as another thing Paul should forgive. Everything is still a performance even when she's actually sick. Paul finally stops crying enough to sit up. His face is red and wet and his eyes are swollen. He wipes his nose on his sleeve like a little kid. He asks me what kind of person does what his mother did. I tell him a very sick person. He asks if being sick excuses it. I tell him no. Being sick explains it but doesn't excuse it. He nods and starts the car. We drive home in complete silence. I watch the familiar streets go past the window. Normal people doing normal things. Someone walking a dog, kids riding bikes, a woman getting mail from her mailbox. Everything looks so regular and calm, and I want to scream at all of them that the world isn't fair or safe or good. We get home and pay the babysitter, and she leaves looking confused by our faces. Emily runs up asking about our day. Paul picks her up and holds her so tight she squeaks. He carries her to the couch and just sits there holding her while she wiggles and asks what's wrong. I tell Emily that Daddy's sad about something, but he'll be okay. She pats his face with her little hands and tells him not to be sad. She says she'll share her goldfish crackers with him. Paul laughs, but it sounds wrong. He kisses the top of her head and tells her he loves her so much. After Emily goes to bed that evening, Paul calls his aunt. I sit next to him on our bed while he puts the phone on speaker. He tells her everything Diane confessed about his father, about the replaced medications, about watching him die, about wasting 10 minutes to stage the scene. The aunt doesn't say anything for a really long time. The silence stretches out so long I think maybe the call dropped. Then she speaks, and her voice sounds old and tired. She says she always suspected something was wrong with how Paul's father died. She says the whole thing never made sense. Healthy man suddenly dead with his wife right there. She says Diane seemed so destroyed at the funeral that she convinced herself she was being paranoid. She says she should have trusted her instincts. She says she's sorry. While Paul talks to his aunt, I open my laptop. I search for factitious disorder. I search for Munchausen by proxy. I read article after article about people who create medical crises for attention. People who induce illness in themselves or others. People who need to be caregivers and victims at the same time. People who can't stop even when they get caught. Every single thing I read describes Diane perfectly. The pattern of escalating medical dramas, the anger when she doesn't get enough sympathy, the way she always has a new crisis right when attention shifts away from her, the inability to maintain the lie, but also the inability to stop lying. I find case studies of people who poisoned family members, who gave them wrong medications, who delayed emergency care. Some of them went to prison. Some of them just destroyed their families and walked away. Paul finishes his call and looks over at my laptop screen. He reads for a while without saying anything. Then he closes the laptop and tells me his father never had a chance. I ask what he means. He says his father was living with someone who needed him to be sick. Someone who couldn't handle him being healthy and independent. Someone who had to create medical emergencies to feel important. His father's actual health problems were just opportunities for Diane to play caregiver and martyr. When the real health problems got too serious, she panicked because she might lose control. So she made it worse by tampering with his medications. Then when he was dying, she had to choose between saving him or saving herself from consequences. She picked herself. The next morning, the medical examiner's office calls. The woman on the phone says our requested records are ready for pickup. Paul tells her he'll be there in an hour. He drives across town to the county building and parks in the visitor lot. I wait in the car while he goes inside. He comes back out carrying a thick manila folder. His hands shake a little bit holding it. We sit in the parking lot and he opens the folder. There's an autopsy report we never knew existed. There are toxicology results. There are photographs we don't look at. There are medical findings typed up in official language. Paul reads out loud from the autopsy report. His father had severe high blood pressure that wasn't being controlled. He had really bad buildup in his arteries. The medical examiner wrote that these conditions should have been managed with medication. The exact medications Diane admitted to replacing with sugar pills. The medical examiner noted the findings matched someone who stopped taking blood pressure medicine for a long time. Paul's hands clench on the papers hard enough to wrinkle them. He says here's the proof in black and white. His mother killed his father by messing with his medications. Then she let him die to cover it up. The medical examiner just didn't know to look for it because nobody suspected anything. Paul calls a lawyer that afternoon. He explains the whole situation on the phone. The lawyer listens and asks questions. Then the lawyer tells him proving criminal charges would be almost impossible now. 5 years have passed. The death was ruled natural causes at the time. Diane is dying, so she can't really be prosecuted anyway. But we could maybe file a wrongful death civil suit. We could potentially get a judgment against Diane's estate. Paul asks what that would accomplish. The lawyer says mostly just acknowledgement in legal terms of what happened. Maybe some money from selling her house. Paul thanks the lawyer and hangs up. We talk about it that night after dinner. I ask Paul if he wants to pursue legal action against Diane. He sits quiet for a long time thinking. Then he says no. He says spending Diane's last days or weeks fighting in court won't bring his father back. It won't give him closure. It won't make anything better. What he wants is a record that acknowledges the truth, even if the legal system never does anything about it. So he spends the next 2 days writing everything down. Every detail Diane confessed, every piece of evidence we found, every timeline of events. He writes it all out in clear, simple language. Then we drive to a notary, and he signs it in front of her, and she stamps it official. Now there's a legal document that says what really happened, even if nobody ever does anything with it. Emily comes into the kitchen while we're making lunch the next day. She asks why we keep talking about Grandma. She says she's never met Grandma, so why do we keep saying her name? She asks if she's going to meet Grandma now. Paul and I look at each other across the kitchen counter. I can see him thinking the same thing I'm thinking. Emily is 3 years old. She doesn't understand death or manipulation or any of this mess. Do we take her to see Diane in the hospital? Does that serve any purpose for Emily, or does it just create problems? Paul leans down close to Emily and asks her if she wants to meet Grandma. Emily shrugs and says she doesn't know. She asks what Grandma is like. Paul glances at me and I give a tiny shake of my head. He tells Emily that Grandma is very sick and probably won't be around much longer. He says sometimes it's better to remember people the way they were before they got sick. Emily asks if Grandma was nice before she got sick. Paul opens his mouth and closes it again. Finally, he just says, Grandma had a lot of problems that made her act in ways that weren't safe for our family. Emily accepts this with the easy way kids accept things and goes back to playing with her toys. We decide right there, without saying it out loud, that Emily doesn't need a deathbed meeting with a grandmother who tried to establish legal claims on her behind our backs. Some relationships aren't worth forcing just because someone is dying. 3 days after we decide Emily doesn't need a deathbed meeting with Diane, Paul's aunt calls again. Her voice sounds strained when she tells us Diane is getting worse fast and keeps asking for Paul. She says Diane barely stays awake anymore, but when she does wake up, she repeats Paul's name over and over. The aunt begs Paul to visit one more time because Diane is clearly dying now and won't last much longer. Paul listens without interrupting and then tells his aunt very calmly that he went once, heard what Diane had to say, and has no obligation to provide comfort to someone who caused so much damage. He says it doesn't matter that she's dying because dying doesn't erase what she did to his father or what she tried to do to our family. The aunt goes quiet for several seconds before her voice gets sharp. She tells Paul he's being cruel to a dying woman, and everyone deserves compassion at the end, regardless of what they did in life. Paul's hand tightens around his phone and his voice stays steady when he responds. He tells his aunt that Diane spent her whole life demanding compassion while showing none to others. He says Diane's terminal illness doesn't erase her responsibility for his father's death or her manipulation of our family. He reminds his aunt that Diane tried to steal our daughter's name through elaborate lies and later tried to establish legal claims on Emily behind our backs. The aunt starts to argue, but Paul tells her he needs to go and ends the call. He sits on the couch staring at his phone for a long time before he looks up at me. I can see the guilt warring with anger in his face, even though I know he made the right choice. I spend the rest of the day thinking about Diane's confessions and whether they're reliable or just more manipulation dressed up as deathbed honesty. The next morning, I call the hospital and ask to speak with the social worker assigned to Diane's case. The receptionist transfers me to Chloe Wagner, who picks up after 2 rings. I explain who I am and that my husband visited Diane recently and heard some disturbing confessions about his father's death. I ask Chloe if Diane's mental state is clear enough to trust what she's saying or if her condition might be causing confusion. Chloe checks Diane's chart and tells me that Diane's cognitive function has been clear during her lucid periods. She says the medical team has noted that Diane's statements have been consistent across multiple conversations, which suggests she's genuinely trying to unburden herself before dying. Chloe's voice is professional but kind when she tells me that many terminal patients experience a need to confess past wrongs as death approaches. I thank her for the information and I'm about to hang up when Chloe mentions something else. She says Diane has been asking to record video messages for Emily. Every alarm bell in my head goes off immediately. I tell Chloe very firmly that Diane has no relationship with our daughter, and we absolutely do not consent to any recordings or messages of any kind. Chloe apologizes and says she'll note our refusal in Diane's file to make sure no staff members help Diane create any content directed at Emily. I hang up feeling angry that even from her deathbed, Diane is still trying to force her way into Emily's life. Paul struggles more over the next few days. I watch him move through the house like he's carrying extra weight on his shoulders. He has trouble sleeping, and when he does sleep, he has nightmares about his father. One night, I wake up to find him sitting at the kitchen table at 3 a.m. reading through his father's old letters. He looks up at me with red eyes and says he needs help processing everything. The next day, I help him research therapists who specialize in family trauma and complicated grief. We find Marguerite Pope, who has excellent reviews and experience with situations involving parental betrayal and preventable death. Paul calls her office and gets an appointment for later that week. His first session lasts 90 minutes, and when he comes home, he looks exhausted but also slightly less burdened. He tells me Marguerite helped him understand that he can grieve both his father and the mother he thought he had while still holding Diane accountable for her actions. Over the next 2 weeks, Paul sees Marguerite twice a week, and I can see him slowly starting to process the layers of loss and betrayal. He stops having nightmares as frequently and starts sleeping through the night again. 2 weeks after our hospital visit, Paul's phone rings while we're making dinner. The caller ID shows a number from the hospital, and Paul answers on speaker. A man introduces himself as Luke Takahashi, Diane's neurologist. He asks if Paul has a moment to talk about Diane's condition as her next of kin. Paul tells him yes and doctor. Takahashi explains that Diane's tumor is progressing faster than they initially expected. He says Diane is now mostly unconscious, and when she does wake up, she's heavily sedated for pain management. He tells us that Diane probably has days rather than weeks remaining based on her current decline. Paul thanks him for the update and is about to end the call when Dr. Takahashi speaks again. His voice is careful when he asks if we've considered that Diane's history of factitious disorder might have contributed to delays in diagnosing her real brain tumor. Paul and I look at each other across the kitchen counter. Doctor. Takahashi continues explaining that patients with documented patterns of faking illness often get dismissed by medical professionals when they present with genuine symptoms. He says it creates a tragic irony where the very behavior that got them attention eventually prevents them from getting help when they actually need it. Paul asks Dr. Takahashi if he's saying Diane's real tumor might have been treatable if caught earlier, but was ignored because of her reputation for making up illnesses. Dr. Takahashi confirms this is possible and pulls up Diane's medical records while we're on the phone. He tells us that Diane complained of severe headaches for over a year before anyone took her seriously enough to order imaging. He says multiple doctors dismissed her as attention-seeking based on her psychiatric history of factitious disorder. By the time someone finally ordered a CT scan, the tumor was already inoperable. Paul's face goes pale, and I can see him processing this new information. He thanks Dr. Takahashi and hangs up. We stand in the kitchen in silence while the pasta water boils over on the stove. I turn off the burner, and we both just stand there thinking about what the doctor said. Diane's pathological lying literally came back to destroy her when she actually needed help. The doctors who might have saved her life if they'd caught the tumor early instead assumed she was faking and ignored her complaints. Paul tells me he doesn't know how to feel about this information. He says part of him thinks Diane got exactly what she deserved, but another part of him recognizes that the outcome seems like too much punishment, even for someone who caused so much harm. At his next therapy session, Paul tells Marguerite about Dr. Takahashi's call and the information about Diane's missed diagnosis. He admits to her that he feels a confusing mix of vindication and horror. He says Diane created the circumstances that led to doctors ignoring her, but watching someone die because they cried wolf too many times still feels wrong somehow. Marguerite helps him sit with the complexity of feeling multiple contradictory things at once. She tells him it's possible to believe Diane deserved consequences for her actions, while also recognizing that dying of an untreated brain tumor is a harsh outcome. Paul comes home from that session looking thoughtful, rather than guilty. He tells me Marguerite said he doesn't have to resolve the contradiction or pick one feeling over the other. He can hold both truths at the same time. I struggle with my own complicated feelings over the next few days. Part of me thinks Diane's fate is grimly appropriate given how she spent years faking illnesses and manipulating medical professionals. But another part of me recognizes that mental illness destroyed Diane just as surely as the tumor did. Her compulsion to fake being sick eventually made it impossible for anyone to believe her when she was actually sick. I think about how Diane's brain was probably already damaged by the tumor when she was faking cancer during my pregnancy. Maybe the tumor was already growing and affecting her judgment and impulse control. Maybe she would have gotten help for her factitious disorder if the tumor hadn't been there making everything worse. I bring these thoughts to our next couple session with Marguerite. I tell her I'm afraid of becoming the kind of person who feels satisfaction at someone's suffering, even when they caused real harm. Marguerite listens carefully, and then asks me what I think the alternative would look like. I realize I don't have a good answer. She tells me that acknowledging Diane's fate has a certain grim logic doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It means I'm being honest about cause and effect while still maintaining my capacity for empathy. She says I can recognize that Diane's outcome makes sense given her actions while also feeling sad that mental illness and medical dismissal combined to create such a terrible end. Marguerite sits forward in her chair during our next session, and her voice is gentle, but firm when she tells us we can hold two truths at the same time. She says we can recognize Diane's mental illness was real and caused her genuine suffering, while also maintaining that our boundaries were necessary and appropriate for protecting our family. Paul's hands are clenched on the armrest, and he asks if that makes us bad people for not forgiving her when she was sick. Marguerite shakes her head and explains that compassion doesn't require reconciliation, and we don't owe Diane a redemption arc she never earned through genuine change or accountability. She tells us that acknowledging someone's mental illness doesn't mean accepting abuse or manipulation, and that we can feel sad about Diane's suffering without feeling guilty about the distance we maintained. Paul's shoulders drop slightly, and I can see some of the tension leave his face as Marguerite continues talking about how protecting Emily was the right choice, regardless of Diane's diagnoses or circumstances. We leave that session feeling steadier, like we've been given permission to feel complicated things without forcing ourselves toward forgiveness we don't actually feel. 2 days later, Paul's aunt calls again, and her voice sounds hollow when she tells us Diane died peacefully in her sleep with hospice nurses present around 3 in the morning. There will be a small funeral in 3 days at the chapel near Diane's house, just family and whoever else wants to come. The aunt pauses, and then her tone gets heavier with something that sounds like judgment when she asks if we'll at least attend the funeral to pay our respects. Paul closes his eyes and tells her he needs to think about it and will call her back tomorrow. After he hangs up, we sit on the couch in silence while Emily plays with her blocks on the living room floor, completely unaware that the grandmother she never met just stopped existing. Paul finally looks at me and asks what I think we should do, and I tell him honestly that I don't know if going to Diane's funeral is about closure for him or just giving in to family pressure and social expectations about how we're supposed to act. We spend the next day debating the funeral question while Emily is at daycare. Paul says part of him wants to go to mark the end of this chapter and witness that Diane really is gone this time. Another part of him thinks showing up feels like pretending their relationship was something it wasn't, like performing grief for relatives who judged us for cutting Diane off in the first place. I point out that funerals are supposedly for the living, and ask if he thinks going will help him process everything, or just make him feel worse. Paul walks circles around our kitchen and finally decides he wants to go, because he needs to see this through to the actual end. But we both agree immediately that Emily stays home with a babysitter, because a funeral for a grandmother she never knew serves absolutely no purpose except maybe confusing her. We call Paul's aunt back and tell her we'll attend, but Emily won't be there, and the aunt makes a disapproving sound but doesn't argue. The funeral happens on a gray Thursday morning at a small chapel that smells like old carpet and furniture polish. The attendance is sparse in a way that feels sad regardless of how we felt about Diane. Paul's aunt sits in the front row with 2 other distant relatives whose names I barely remember from the birthday party exposure 3 years ago. A handful of neighbors who probably didn't know about the fake cancer saga fill a few middle pews. Then I notice 2 women sitting together near the back who look somehow out of place, and I realize with a jolt that they're wearing shirts with cancer awareness ribbons and look like they came from support groups. The cognitive dissonance hits me hard because we're mourning someone who lied about dying while actually dying, and these women apparently knew Diane through her fake cancer personas, but still showed up to pay respects. The whole scene feels surreal and wrong in ways I can't fully process. The service is brief and awkward with a hospice chaplain who clearly didn't know Diane personally leading generic prayers. Then Paul stands up and walks to the front, and I hold my breath wondering what he'll say. His eulogy is maybe 3 minutes long and honest without being cruel. He talks about how his mother struggled with serious mental illness that hurt the people around her, and how her death is both a loss and a relief, because suffering has ended, but so has the possibility of things ever being different. Several relatives shift uncomfortably in their seats, and Paul's aunt dabs at her eyes with a tissue, but the hospice chaplain nods slightly like he approves of Paul refusing to sanitize Diane's legacy into something prettier than reality. Paul's voice stays steady the whole time, and when he sits back down beside me, I squeeze his hand hard. After the service ends, people mill around awkwardly near the chapel entrance, making quiet small talk. One of the women from the back approaches us slowly and introduces herself as someone who was in online support groups with Diane. She explains carefully that she figured out Diane was faking years ago, but stayed connected because she recognized Diane was deeply unwell and isolated in ways that went beyond the lies. Paul stiffens beside me, but the woman continues talking in a gentle voice about how Diane talked about Paul and Emily constantly in her final months. She says Diane expressed what sounded like genuine remorse for the harm she caused, mixed with continued attempts to justify her actions and make herself the victim. The woman tells us Diane seemed to understand on some level that she'd destroyed her relationships, but couldn't fully accept responsibility even at the very end. The woman reaches into her purse and pulls out a sealed envelope that looks slightly worn. She tells Paul that Diane wrote this letter before she became too sick to hold a pen and marked it clearly to be delivered after her death. Paul stares at the envelope for a long moment without reaching for it, and I can see him trying to decide if he wants to read what might be his mother's final manipulation attempt or possibly her first truly genuine apology. Finally, he takes the envelope and tucks it in his jacket pocket unopened. He thanks the woman quietly and says he'll decide later if he's ready to read whatever Diane wanted to say when she couldn't demand an immediate response or attention for her words. We drive home in complete silence, and Paul holds my hand across the console like he's grounding himself in our present reality instead of drowning in the past. The sky stays gray and heavy the whole drive. When we pick up Emily from the babysitter, she takes one look at our faces and asks in her small, serious voice if we're sad. Paul crouches down to her level and tells her yes, they're sad about someone who died, but they're also grateful for their family and the life they've built together. Emily hugs his neck hard and asks if we can have mac and cheese for dinner, and the normalcy of the request makes my throat tight. That night, after Emily finally falls asleep, Paul sits on our bed holding Diane's letter and staring at it like it might explode. I sit beside him and put my hand on his knee for support. He tears open the envelope with shaking fingers and pulls out 3 pages covered in Diane's handwriting that looks shakier than I remember, but still clearly hers. Paul reads silently for several minutes while I watch his face cycle through different expressions. Finally, he starts reading parts out loud in a voice that keeps breaking. The letter is surprisingly coherent and self-aware in ways Diane never managed in person. She acknowledges her factitious disorder diagnosis from a psychiatrist she saw briefly 2 years ago, but quit seeing when the doctor pushed too hard about her patterns. She writes about how she couldn't stop creating medical crises even knowing it destroyed her relationships, like some part of her brain was broken in a way she couldn't fix or control. She expresses what reads as genuine remorse for tampering with Paul's father's medications, and for wasting those crucial minutes when he was dying because she panicked about being caught. The second page includes specific details about Paul's father that only Diane would know. She writes about how he always hummed the same Beatles song while making coffee in the morning, and how he had this inside joke about calling her his co-pilot that started on their honeymoon road trip. She describes the exact way he took his coffee with 2 sugars and cream heated separately in the microwave for exactly 30 seconds. These tiny, intimate details prove these are Diane's real words, and not another fabrication, and I watch Paul's face crumple as he reads about his father through his mother's memories. The final page talks about how Diane hopes Paul can eventually forgive her, not for her sake since she'll be gone, but so the poison she created doesn't continue destroying his peace and his ability to trust people. She writes that she knows she has no right to ask anything, but she hopes someday he'll tell Emily that her grandmother was sick in ways that had nothing to do with tumors, and that mental illness deserves compassion even when it causes terrible harm. Paul's hands shake as he reaches the final paragraph, his breath catching when he reads Diane's closing words about Emily. The letter acknowledges she has no right to ask anything about their daughter, but there's this quiet hope buried in the sentences that maybe someday. When Emily is old enough to understand complicated things, Paul might tell her that her grandmother was sick in ways that had nothing to do with tumors. Diane writes that mental illness deserves compassion, even when it causes terrible harm, and I watch Paul's face crumple as he processes this last request from a woman who spent her life demanding sympathy, while showing none to others. He sets the pages down on our bed and just sits there staring at nothing, tears running down his face in silence. I move closer and wrap my arms around him, feeling his shoulders shake as he cries for everything this letter represents. It's genuine accountability without excuses, real remorse mixed with a request for grace Diane never extended to anyone else in her life. Paul leans into me and his voice breaks when he finally speaks, saying he doesn't know if he'll ever fully forgive his mother for what she did to his father or for the years of manipulation. But he's grateful she finally told the truth, even if it came too late to repair anything between them, even if she had to be dying for real before she could be honest. We sit together on our bed holding each other while the letter pages scatter across the blanket, this final complicated gift from Diane settling into our lives like dust after an explosion. The weeks after the funeral blur together in a strange mix of relief and processing. Paul keeps his weekly appointments with Marguerite and starts working through his father's death with the new information about what really happened. I drive him to therapy every Tuesday evening and wait in the car reading while he sits in that office confronting 5 years of grief built on incomplete truths. Marguerite helps him separate his feelings about his father from his anger at his mother, working through this idea that he can mourn his dad's preventable death while acknowledging that Diane's mental illness was also a form of tragedy. Paul comes home from these sessions looking exhausted but lighter somehow, like he's setting down weights he didn't know he was carrying. He tells me Marguerite explained that he's been carrying survivor's guilt about his father mixed with rage at his mother, and untangling those emotions is harder than just staying angry. One night he admits he keeps having this recurring thought that if his dad had lived, maybe Diane would have gotten help earlier. Maybe the fake cancer never would have happened. Marguerite apparently shut that down fast, reminding him that Diane's patterns started long before his father died, and her disorders weren't anyone's responsibility to fix except hers. A lawyer named Richard Chandler calls on a Thursday morning about 6 weeks after Diane's death, introducing himself as the executor of her estate. Paul takes the call in our kitchen while I make breakfast for Emily, and I watch his face cycle through surprise and suspicion as he listens. The lawyer explains that Diane left everything to Paul in a surprisingly straightforward will, with no manipulative conditions attached, no requirements about Emily's name, or forced reconciliation from beyond the grave. The estate is modest according to Chandler, just the house with some equity since Diane paid off the mortgage years ago, a small savings account that survived her gambling and personal belongings. Paul asks about strings or hidden clauses, clearly waiting for the other shoe to drop, but Chandler assures him the will is clean and includes a separate letter apologizing for the life insurance attempt on Emily. The letter confirms Diane never succeeded in establishing any legal claims on our daughter, despite multiple attempts with different lawyers who all turned her down. Paul hangs up and just stands there holding his coffee mug, processing that his mother's final act was surprisingly free of manipulation. I ask him what he wants to do with Diane's house, and he doesn't even hesitate before saying he wants to sell it, that he has no interest in keeping it as some kind of shrine to complicated family history. We list Diane's house in early spring with a real estate agent who doesn't know the backstory. Paul goes through the house one weekend taking photos and a few small items, his father's watch and some old photo albums, but he leaves most of Diane's belongings for an estate sale company to handle. Walking through those rooms feels surreal after 3 years of complete separation, seeing the nursery Diane decorated for a grandchild she never met, now dusty and untouched. The presents she bought for Emily's milestones are still stacked in the corner, wrapped and labeled for birthdays that have already passed. Paul stands in that room for a long time just looking around before he closes the door and tells the agent to clear everything out. The house sells fast to a young couple expecting their first baby, which feels like some kind of cosmic irony that Paul laughs about darkly. We use part of the proceeds to pay off our car and put money into Emily's college fund, but Paul has this idea about doing something constructive with the rest. He researches cardiac health programs and finds a small community college near where his father worked that offers a nursing certificate with a focus on cardiac care. We establish a scholarship fund in his father's name for students studying cardiac health, turning some of the pain into something that might prevent other families from losing someone to preventable heart problems. The paperwork takes weeks, but Paul throws himself into it, working with the college foundation to set up the criteria and funding structure. He tells me it doesn't erase what Diane did, but it gives his father's death some meaning beyond just being a casualty of his mother's mental illness. Emily starts asking more questions about death and family as spring turns to summer. She's processing that we went to a funeral, that Daddy was sad about someone dying, and her 4-year-old brain is working through what that means. We sit with her one evening after dinner and give her age-appropriate, honest answers about what happened. Paul crouches down to her level and explains that his mommy died, and it's sad because all death is sad. But sometimes people are sick in ways that make it hard for them to be safe for others to be around. That's why Emily never met her, why we didn't bring her to visit or let her come to our house. Emily asks if Grandma was mean, and Paul pauses, choosing his words carefully before saying she wasn't mean on purpose, but she was sick in her brain, and that made her do things that hurt people. Emily seems satisfied with this explanation and asks if we can have ice cream, the conversation apparently complete in her mind. Paul and I look at each other over her head, and I can see the relief on his face that we managed to be honest without traumatizing her. We agree later that night that we'll add complexity as she grows and can understand more difficult concepts, but the foundation will always be honest, even when the truth is complicated. 6 months after Diane's death, Paul has a breakthrough in therapy that he comes home excited to tell me about. We're sitting on our back porch while Emily plays in the yard, and Paul explains that Marguerite helped him articulate something he's been feeling but couldn't name. He's grieving 3 losses at the same time, 3 separate deaths that all got tangled together in his mind. There's his father's preventable death, which is straightforward grief mixed with anger at the circumstances. There's the mother he needed but never had, grieving the parent Diane could have been if her mental illness hadn't consumed her ability to love people in healthy ways. And there's the grandmother Emily deserved but couldn't safely know, grieving the relationship his daughter lost before it could even start. Marguerite validated that this triple grief is real and will take time to process, that he's not being dramatic or overthinking things. Paul tells me this recognition feels like permission to be sad about all of it, without having to pick which loss matters most, or justify his feelings. I watch him talk about his therapy with this openness that's new, this willingness to be vulnerable about his emotions, instead of just staying angry because anger is simpler. I notice Paul sleeping better as fall approaches, fewer nightmares about his father's death jerking him awake at 3 a.m. He used to have these terrible dreams where he'd see his father dying over and over, imagining increasingly horrible versions of those final minutes. Now he still has bad dreams sometimes, but they're less frequent and less intense, and he can usually fall back asleep instead of lying awake for hours. One night after a rare nightmare, he tells me that knowing the truth is actually better than not knowing, even though the truth is painful and makes him angry. The uncertainty was worse because his imagination created scenarios even more terrible than reality, his brain filling in blanks with increasingly awful possibilities. Now he can properly mourn his father's death for what it actually was, instead of wondering and guessing and torturing himself with maybes. He says it's like having a wound that's been infected for 5 years finally getting cleaned out, how it hurts worse at first, but then it can actually heal. I hold his hand in the dark and think about how Diane's confession was probably the cruelest kindness, giving Paul the truth he needed, but only after making him wait 5 years to know it. We have a conversation one Sunday morning about what we'll tell Emily about her grandfather when she's older and ready for more details. Paul wants to focus on who his father was as a person, the good parts that existed before Diane's actions cut his life short. We decide we'll tell Emily a simple version first, that her grandfather was kind and funny and loved his family, and he died because he was sick and didn't get the help he needed in time. As she grows, we'll add complexity about how sometimes people have invisible illnesses that need treatment just like physical ones, how his heart condition should have been managed but wasn't. Eventually, when she's old enough to understand really difficult concepts, we'll explain that her grandmother's mental illness played a role in his death, but we'll be careful to separate mental illness in general from Diane's specific choices and actions. Paul says he wants Emily to grow up understanding that mental illness is real and deserves compassion, but also that having an illness doesn't erase someone's responsibility for the harm they cause. It's a delicate balance, but we both agree that's the truth we want to teach her, that people can be sick and still accountable, that compassion and boundaries can exist together. Paul frames one photo of Diane that he finds in a box from her house, a picture of her laughing at his college graduation. In the photo, she looks genuinely happy and proud, her arm around Paul's shoulders while he holds his diploma, both of them smiling at the camera with real joy on their faces. This was before the fake cancer, before his father's death, back when Diane's disorders were less obvious, or at least less destructive. Paul hangs the photo in his office at home, not in a prominent place, but on a side wall where he'll see it occasionally. He tells me it's not forgiveness exactly, more like acknowledgement that his mother was a whole person who contained both the capacity for love and the pathology that destroyed it. The woman in that photo existed even if she couldn't sustain that version of herself, even if her mental illness eventually consumed everything good about her. I understand what he means about needing to remember she was human, and not just a monster, that reducing her to only the harm she caused would be its own kind of dishonesty. Some mornings I catch Paul looking at that photo with this expression I can't quite read, something between sadness and acceptance, and I know he's still processing everything that happened and probably will be for years. Emily turns 4 on a Tuesday morning, and we celebrate with pancakes shaped like butterflies, which she insists on helping flip even though she gets more batter on herself than the griddle. Paul takes pictures of her covered in flour and maple syrup, laughing so hard she snorts, and I see him blink back tears that aren't sad exactly, but complicated in the way everything about our family has become. We've been seeing Marguerite together for a year now, working through the layers of grief and anger and relief that came with Diane's death, and Paul says he's learned to sit with the contradictions instead of trying to resolve them into something simple. Some days he's furious at his mother for what she did to his father. Other days he feels sad that her mental illness destroyed her so completely, and most days he feels both things at once without needing one to cancel out the other. We talk about Diane sometimes when Emily asks questions, giving her small pieces of truth that fit her understanding, telling her that Daddy's mommy was sick in ways that made it hard for her to be safe, and that's why Emily never met her. Emily accepts this the way 4-year-olds accept most things, with curiosity but without the weight adults carry, and moves on to asking if we can get a puppy. The house we bought with money from selling Diane's place feels like ours in a way our old apartment never did, full of Emily's artwork on the fridge, and Paul's terrible attempts at gardening in the backyard, and the quiet peace of knowing we built this together. We still have hard days when Paul gets quiet and distant, processing something new about his father's death or his mother's pathology, and I've learned to sit beside him without trying to fix it because some things can't be fixed, only survived. Emily brings us dandelions from the yard and declares them beautiful, and Paul tells her she's right, that something can be a weed and still deserve appreciation, And I know he's talking about more than flowers. We're building something different from what either of us had growing up. A family culture where people say what they mean and mean what they say, where boundaries are respected and honesty matters more than keeping peace. It's messy and imperfect, and some days I worry we're screwing it up in new and creative ways, but mostly I watch Emily run through the sprinkler shrieking with joy and think we're doing okay.